Before I start, I just want to thank James and say that his reference to the terrible C word, the content word, I think is exactly right. I would urge everybody in the room to stop using that word, particularly when you're talking about art, whether that's film or any other art form. It's a filthy word and we shouldn't use it. What's the point of a television archive? So I'm delighted to have been invited to speak to you here today. So I set this very interesting question to consider. What's the point of a television archive? It's a daunting challenge indeed. And if you're not careful, you can quickly find yourself pondering everything all the way up to the nature of life, the universe and everything. And I'll end up asking, well, what's the point of anything at all? And of course, coming from the BBC, I do at least have the luxury of answering that question, 42. Feeling like up to a point get away with that. But only up to a point, of course, because anyone who's familiar with the traditions of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy will know that the next thing you have to do is work out what the question is. So I'm back to the start. So I'll start all over again. So until now, I'd never, ever really considered what the point of the BBC's archives was. I focused much more on thinking about what we might do or hopefully allow others to do with this huge volume of assets that we've collected and retained over the past almost 100 years. And we've come up with hundreds of ways that we think the digitised archives of the BBC might be used in new creative and innovative contexts, often as commercial opportunities, but always to deliver substantial public value and benefit to everyone, free at the point of use wherever possible. And therefore, I'm grateful to have been prompted to ask what the archive itself is actually for. And I have to admit, I've had a rather challenging time trying to come up with a simple answer for you today. So here's a list of the possible things I considered, no particular order. So there are many reasons why we hold on to the material that we have in our archives, and as you all know, we have a huge amount of it. For posterity, as James says, and the BBC in particular has had access to a vast array of important people and events of the past century, probably more than any other public institution in the world. And keeping as much of that as our limited shelf space and our budgets have allowed is, we believe, a duty to the public. That's today, tomorrow, and right down through the generations. As a social history of the 4 nations that make up the UK, and indeed as a unique perspective on the countries across the world. Changes to mores and traditions, to language, behaviours, attitudes, custom and practice, patterns of consumption and culture. Television is a compelling and accessible medium, reducing in many ways the need for formal education or other skills to extract meaning and understanding. We keep them for reuse or spare parts, as I often only half-jokingly refer to it. The capture of unrepeatable moments in time that may potentially be reused in entirely new creative works is not only good husbandry, but it's also an invaluable resource for future storytellers. We keep stuff to rebroadcast, although in reality this happened far less frequently in the past than people seem to believe. And although today it's far more common for programmes to be broadcast many times after their original screening, most programmes in the main still tend to disappear from view after a relatively short lifespan. However, after reading Joanne Garde-Hansen's excellent book on media and memory, and for those of you who've not managed to get hold of a copy of it yet, I would strongly recommend that you do, I was increasingly intrigued by the role of television and television's archives in stimulating and representing memory, both personal and collective, and it's this notion of memory that really caught my imagination. And my generation was the first to grow up with television. It was there from the moment I was born and has adapted and developed significantly as techniques and technologies have developed and been refined over the past 50 or so years. And as Tim Minchin so insightfully put it in the stage adaptation of Roald Dahl's Matilda, also highly recommended, all I know I learnt from telly, this big beautiful box of facts. And here I pause for thought for a moment. Because what and who determines these facts? And when is a fact not, in fact, a fact? And so with Tim's jolly ditty playing in my mind, I tried to look at the original question from 2 distinct angles. Is it really asking, what's the point of a television archive in contrast to, say, any other archive? Or is it, what's the specific point of the archive of television in relation to the broader medium of television itself? Well, in any case, in either case, the answer I've arrived at for both versions of that question is evidence. And before I give you my reasons for choosing that option over the others, let me pose or attempt to answer a slightly different question. What's the point or purpose of media? Now, my very good friend and ex-BBC colleague, Matt Locke, now of the company Story Things, suggests it's this: the movement of thoughts and ideas through time and space. I really like the simplicity of that. It's a clear purpose that explains the mission of storytellers throughout all time, and hence our continuing drive to invent and develop new forms of media to help us achieve that objective. Now, all media are, in my opinion at least, limited by the technology that produces them, and broadcasting, and in this case television, has significant limitations to contend with, despite the otherwise miraculous properties that broadcasting possesses. In this so-called digital age, television's production and distribution technologies have increasingly apparent limitations, and its output is in many ways shaped by the creative decisions that are forced upon producers and editors by these limitations. And I'll list a few. There's the schedule slot. It's often exactly 30 or 60 minutes, including ad breaks, meaning that stories have to fit the time allocated rather than be free to be told at their optimal length. There's one-size-fits-all delivery. Everyone gets the same thing at the same time with little or no feedback loop. What you see is literally what you get, no more, no less. And broadcasting's rare ability to scale to millions of viewers at zero marginal cost also means that any sense of a deeper engagement is left to the individual to undertake on their own, away from the broadcast. There's the availability of appropriate footage. We are often frustratingly limited in our ability to gain access to locations or individuals. And as we all know, the lack of available facts has never been allowed to get in the way of a good story. There's editorial structure, often decided in advance, with subsequent filming shaped or chosen to fit a predetermined storyline. And then there are imposed changes, essentially the opposite of that, where the only material available either doesn't fit or can't be made to fit the original intended narrative, often forcing the story to change mid-process, occasionally partway through the programme itself. As well as these, there are editorial choices, local or political bias, advertiser or sponsor sensitivities. There's a lack of time, bad weather, grumpy talent, and so on and so on. And all of these constraints mean that producers are forced to make compromises or use their honed skills to fill in the blanks, to channel the viewer down particular avenues that will inevitably lead to less than ideal conclusions. And at the risk of courting controversy, using something akin to magic to create the illusion of a definitive and authoritative work, rather than what is often little more than a precarious collection of footage and sounds crafted together to fit into a slot in the schedule that's often perceived to be more valuable than the actual programme within it. Now, one tends to notice this the first time you see a programme on a subject that you're yourself an expert in, and it makes you ask yourself, blimey, if they're this wrong about this, are they wrong about everything? Well, maybe not everyone thinks that, but I must admit on occasion I have. Now, whatever your own thoughts on that point, it's certainly the case that what the viewer finally gets to see on television may be significantly and substantially different to either the intended story or at odds with the wide range of equally possible stories that could have been produced from all of the same material that's been amassed during the production process. So let me get back to that notion of evidence. Archives are, in many respects, designed to do precisely this: provide evidence. Archives, and in particular television archives, are not libraries, despite a tendency among us all from time to sometimes use both terms interchangeably. Whereas libraries are principally concerned with collections of completed works, which are then arranged for the public to access, for borrowing or for reference, television archives retain all manner of material, gathered at any point throughout the entire production process, starting as far back as the original idea or commission, and collecting used and, just as importantly, unused material right up to the final edit. As a result, it's possible to revisit decisions made or material rejected, digressions or bias, whether intended or otherwise, and to allow a retrospective consideration of all of the components of our production processes in order to better understand or even, on occasion, challenge the programme as broadcast. And of course, the primary function here is to support and, where necessary, to defend a complex series of choices made by our extremely well-trained, thoroughly professional, diligent programme makers. Making television programmes, like all processes of composition, always involves hard choices. And producers and editors are forced to make tough calls, knowing that they'll be rarely thanked and often criticised, regardless of the relative success or otherwise of their work. Nevertheless, what we experience through our screens, be that journalism, documentary or dramatisation, is frequently all we really know or think we know about a subject or an event. Without television, only a select few of us would have known how a cheetah in full flight moved, or what the inside of a concentration camp was really like, or how majestic and irresistible Laurie Cunningham was in his prime. But at the same time, it's also true that our ability to recall the past or to bear witness to events we have experienced through television is entirely contingent upon a structured narrative that is itself shaped by the nature of television broadcasting. In this, the medium is most certainly the message. There's no shortage of anecdotes about people convinced that they experienced firsthand events that were, despite being based on fact, entirely manufactured for or by television. A substantial amount of what I believe I know about World War I came to me entirely via my TV, despite there being no television cameras around at the time to record it. Because of the limitations imposed, a lot of the background information, supporting evidence, is left behind on the cutting room floor and cannot possibly make it into the finished programme. But luckily for us all, a very substantial amount of that material is swept up by the producers and editors and placed in the custody of the archivists, where it's preserved for all of the reasons I listed at the start, and remains there for us to revisit at a later date, should the need or the opportunity to do so arise. And now, with digital technologies, those additional resources can potentially be made accessible to a far greater range of us, to explore, to examine, and to consider in greater depth and detail the stories, both told and untold, that have shaped our memories of the past, allowing us to either confirm or refute what we remember, or what we think we remember, or what we've subsequently discovered about ourselves and our past. So, to sum up, at the BBC, we maintain our archives for a variety of reasons: for posterity, as stories about us as nations, for reuse, and so on. But perhaps the most interesting reason of all, in the context of memory, is for evidence. At its best, television is an extraordinarily compelling medium, allowing stories, events, and people, both known and otherwise, to be captured and realised through time and space, and for the resulting stories to be shared with millions of people in the most social or intimate of places. Television enables creative endeavour to enrich lives by enabling anyone in the world to see the world through the eyes of others in ways that were simply not possible before the invention of moving image broadcasting. The archive is not the endpoint of all this, but rather at the centre of it all. It contains the evidence of a journey towards a conclusion and all the points of inflection along the way. But perhaps in future, the point of a television archive, or the archives of any publicly funded organisation for that matter, will be to ensure that the public have access to the evidence of their own memories of the past. To actively encourage not only professionals and institutions to use and derive benefits from these resources that were created using public money, but that everyone else too, so that we are all invited to explore and to discover and to contribute. Now, sometimes what will turn up will be surprising, and sometimes it will be alarming. Sometimes it may simply give joy. But it's my genuine hope that enabling everyone to rummage around in the television's archives will never be harmful nor unjustifiable, and certainly never, ever boring. Thank you for listening.